All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going on a trip back in time, landing in China's Qing dynasty. We're talking about the 1644 to 1911 period, but we're not getting bogged down in all the usual stuff, emperors, wars, all that. Instead, we're going deep into the minds of the Qing dynasty's scholars. We're going to see how they tackled, really wrestled with some of the biggest questions out there. You know, the nature of reality, knowledge, how humans fit into the grand scheme of things. We're trying to see how they acted as philosophers in their own time.
Yeah, that's it. And for this intellectual adventure, our compass is going to be the King philosophy entry
Yeah.
in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's like a master key, unlocks all these complex ideas.
Yeah.
And one thing that really jumps out, one thing that's super interesting, is that King philosophy, it kind of veers off in a whole new direction. It's not just more of the same old stuff.
Right, right. So before the Qing, we've got the Song and Ming dynasties. And those were super influenced by Neo-Confucianism. Confucianism, that's a whole other deep dive. But the Song and Ming versions, they were all about introspection, like looking inward deep inside yourself.
Yeah.
The idea was, if you look hard enough, you can grasp these big metaphysical truths, the nature of heaven, the universal principles, all that. It was all about this internal search for understanding.
Exactly. And then come the Qing dynasty thinkers.
Yeah.
And they kind of push back against this. They start to look outward, the world around them, the material stuff, history, the nitty-gritty practical concerns, all become part of their philosophical toolbox. Our source even calls it a rupture. Of course, intellectual history, it's never a clean break. There's always some carryover from what came before.
So more like a branching out than a clean break.
Yeah, I like that. Branching out.
So we have King philosophy. But we got to remember, that's a label historians came up with. It's a way to make sense of the patterns, the common threads in all these different thinkers. And our source, it lays out four main approaches. Ideal types, they call them. Vitalism, historicism, utilitarianism, intellectualism. They're like different filters, different ways of seeing the world. And through these filters, these King scholars were, in a way, acting as philosophers, trying to figure out these big existential questions.
What's really fascinating is, these aren't labels these King guys would use for themselves. They're tools that we use now looking back. They help us understand the major intellectual currents, help us see how these thinkers, how they were philosophizing within their specific time and place.
Right, right. So our mission today, to understand how these four modes of thought, vitalism, historicism, utilitarianism, and intellectualism, how they shaped the intellectual landscape of the Qing dynasty. How did they push philosophical inquiry in new directions? How did they move away from that primarily introspective focus of the Song and Ming? Okay, so let's kick things off with vitalism. Our source describes it as a metaphysical reorientation. What exactly does that mean? How did Qing thinkers change things up?
Well, with vitalism, it's all about ki. It's often translated as material force or sometimes psychophysical force. Think of it like the basic energy, the stuff that makes up everything in reality. It's dynamic, it's always moving and changing. And this was a big change, a shift from the Neo-Confucian focus on lie, principle, T's in heaven and Tao all the way, all these transcendent creative powers. Vitalism, it brought things down to earth, so to speak. It emphasized the stuff you can actually see and touch.
So instead of searching for these abstract eternal principles, vitalism was like, hey, let's look at what's right in front of us. The evidence is there in our bodies, in the natural world. It's about real concrete experiences. It's about the actual stuff happening around us, not these big airy theories. Our source mentions this shift from the ontological to the ontic. I know it's kind of jargony.
Yeah.
But it basically points to this new way of framing things.
It does, yeah. Think of it this way. The ontological is all about the grand blueprint of the universe, right? The big design. Whereas the ontic is about the materials, how things work, the nuts and bolts. And Wang Fuzi, a key figure in early Qing thought, he lays out this vitalist perspective really systematically. He argued that ki is, in fact, what life follows, what principle follows. That ki is the fundamental stuff, the foundation of even the supreme void. It's like flipping the script on the traditional understanding.
It really is. It's like he's saying, okay, scratch what you thought you knew. We're starting fresh. And he didn't stop there, did he? He also challenged the separation between heaven nature and physical nature. He said our physical nature, the one tied to our bodies, to ki, that is the original nature. So a much more unified, integrated view of the universe and our place in it.
Absolutely. He saw values, things like ritual propriety or, good governance, as deeply intertwined with human emotions, ranking, and even those private desires we all have that see you. So for Wang Fuzi, the body isn't just a vessel, it's a source of ethical experience. Morality isn't just following rules, it's about how we experience the world through our physical selves. And for him, practice, actively engaging with the world and nurturing one's ki, that was the key to fulfilling your true nature. It was about action, not just abstract thinking.
So a much more embodied way of thinking about philosophy, right? Okay,
Mhm.
and our source also mentions Gu Yanwu and Huang Zongji. They were around at the same time as Wang Fuzi, and they also saw Qi as this fundamental force. Huang even said Li is just the Li of Qi. Basically, he's saying the difference between them is just semantics. It seems like this idea of Qi being primary, it really caught on.
It did. They were all kind of wrestling with that Neo-Confucian legacy, trying to find a new way to describe the building blocks of reality. Huang, for example, he described how fundamentally there's just this one key flowing through everything, and its movements, the way it changes, that's what we perceive as lie.
Yeah.
He saw this inherent order within the material world itself.
An inherent order, yeah.
Yeah.
And then we get to Daizin in the 18th century. He takes this key-based philosophy and runs with it. He argued that the Tao, the way itself, it's actually made up of real concrete things. And he criticized the Song Neo-Confucians. He thought they separated moral values from everyday life, from the things we do, the things that make us human. He was essentially saying, philosophy, it has to be grounded in reality.
And what's brilliant about Dai Zen's work is how he insisted that principle, it isn't some abstract thing out there. He saw lie as this intertexture of things, the tioli. It's something that's woven into everything, and it's inseparable from our feelings, from our desires. He even separated what is naturally so, our desires, our daily activities, from what is necessarily so principle, that intrinsic order within the natural world. He basically grounded morality in our human experience.
Right. He's like, morality, it's not up in the clouds. It's here in the real world and how we live our lives. But our source makes an important point. It says that even though vitalism put Kui at the center, it wasn't exactly like Western materialism. There were some key differences.
And that's really important. It wasn't about reducing everything to just matter. There was still this sense the key had order within itself. It was dynamic. There was potential in it. But this idea of the world being fundamentally key-based, well, it became a kind of core assumption for Qing thinkers. It shaped their worldview and became a foundation for other ways of acting as philosophers.
Okay, so we've got this material turn with vitalism. Now, let's shift gears to our second ideal type, historicism. Now, when we talk about historicism in this context, it's not about a specific theory of history. It's more like a sense of history, this idea that things change over time. So how did this affect how Qing scholars approached philosophical questions?
Well, building on vitalism, on the emphasis on the concrete and the specific, we see this growing appreciation for the contingent nature of things. They moved away from those grand universal truths and focused on particulars, on context. Thinkers like Wang Fuzi, Gu Jianwu, and Huang Zongji, they all started to approach their subjects by examining how they developed, how they changed over time, and within specific historical situations. They weren't trying to find one single explanation for everything.
So they're seeing things as evolving, changing over time, not static. Our source mentions Huang Zongji and his view of the mind heart, the sin. He saw it as constantly in motion, taking different forms. He emphasized efforts, the process of cultivation over some kind of fixed substance. He saw the world, both the external world and our internal lives, as much more dynamic, fluid.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he applied this historical perspective to institutions too. He studied how political and social institutions changed over time, and he realized that you couldn't just copy-paste the old ways. He saw that his time had its own challenges, its own circumstances that demanded new solutions. He saw himself as part of this ongoing flow of history.
Makes sense. And Wang Fuzi, he developed this theory of shi, or conditions. He linked it to li, principle. He argued that principle is embedded in qi and then it manifests in these concrete historical conditions. And since these conditions change, he said that principle also changes. It's not absolute. Even institutions, he believed, were specific to each historical age.
It's a really insightful understanding of how things are interconnected. Principle isn't this abstract ideal. It's interwoven with the realities of a specific moment in time. And just like Huang, he emphasized that institutions evolve. And you got to understand them in their historical context to make them work.
And Gu Yanwu, according to our source, he took a really practical approach. He focused on how institutions evolved, how they changed. He emphasized how institutions functioned, what purpose they served, and how they needed to be reformed to keep up with the times. He was less concerned with abstract principles and more interested in how things actually worked.
Yeah, he was a big believer in adaptation. He saw history as this process of constant change. and he was all about regular reforms to avoid decline.
Interesting. And here's something interesting our source points out. It says that even though these thinkers valued historical context, they still held on to the universal values in the ancient classics. So their historicism wasn't a total rejection of tradition.
It's a really important nuance. They weren't throwing out the old ways entirely, but they weren't taking them at face value either. They were trying to balance an appreciation for the uniqueness of their own time with a respect for the wisdom of the past.
Right, right. And this tension, it becomes even more apparent with the rise of evidential research, or Qing, in the mid-Qing. The original goal was to go back to the classics to uncover the true original way. But by looking at the texts so closely through this historical and philological lens, they ended up historicizing them. The classics became objects in time, something to be studied within their specific context.
Yeah, it's a bit ironic. They wanted to purify tradition, but they ended up changing how it was understood. By looking at the language, the historical details, they started to see the classics in a new light. Dazen, for instance, with his concept of expedient weighing of circumstances, the Quan, and his emphasis on change, Hivardian, he suggested that even right and wrong should be evaluated based on what was practical in a given historical situation.
So he's saying context matters. He's looking at practical implications, not just applying some rigid, timeless standard. But again, our source says that even Daisen had his limits. He still believed in the necessary Byron and the universal validity of the ancient sages' wisdom.
Right, he wasn't willing to let go of the idea of a fundamental order. And then there's Zhang Zucheng. He made this famous statement, "These six classics are all histories." He essentially argued that the Tao itself, it was embedded in history.
That's a bold statement. It blurs the lines between these timeless truths and the historical context in which they emerged. He was a strong advocate for studying current history and institutions, but even he, according to our source, believed in this transhistorical Tao of the ancient sages.
So even with Zhang Zucheng, there's this pull towards something universal, something enduring. Our source concludes that Qing thought it definitely involved rethinking the individual as a historical being. But they didn't abandon the idea of the ancient way. They were still trying to connect with the past, but in a more dynamic, historically informed way.
Which leads us to our third ideal type, utilitarianism. Now, when we hear utilitarianism, we might think about, Western philosophy, maximizing happiness, all that. But in the context of Qing philosophy, what did it mean? How did it play out and how they acted as philosophers?
In the Qing context, utilitarianism, it was all about ordering the world and extending utility, the Jingshizheng. Thought and action, they were inseparable. You see this shift away from purely metaphysical ideas. They wanted ideas that could be put into practice, ideas that could have a real impact on the world.
So it wasn't just about intellectual exercises. It was about making things better, improving governance, making a difference in people's lives. And our source is careful to point out that this wasn't some kind of cold, calculating utilitarianism. It was still rooted in Confucian values.
Absolutely. They wanted practical solutions, but they also wanted those solutions to be guided by principles of good governance, righteousness, a concern for the well-being of society. Thinkers like Gu Yanwu, he really hated what he called empty and vacuous learning, stuff that was irrelevant to real-world problems. He believed learning should connect with the six classics and with current events.
He wanted knowledge that could be applied, knowledge that had real value. And he even wrote his records of daily knowledge as a guide for rulers. He saw scholarship as a tool for making society better.
Yeah, he was all about that. And Huang Zhangji, he shared this view. He believed a Junzi, a person of noble character, their duty was to bring peace to the country and protect society. He was critical of those scholars who had these lofty ideas, but no practical plan for putting them into action. He thought the classics in history, they held the wisdom needed for good governance.
It's like they were saying, okay, enough with all the abstract theories. Let's put our brains to work and solve some problems. And even Wang Fuzi, who we talked about earlier, he criticized this kind of empty intellectualism. He said learning had to have practical intellectual value. It had to serve both personal development and good governance. And he valued history because of the practical lessons it offered.
He saw history as this incredible teacher. Now, our source brings up this idea that utilitarianism maybe declined in the 18th century with the rise of Qing, that meticulous textual research.
Yeah.
But it argues that actually utilitarian thinking was still alive and well among those Qing scholars.
That's an interesting point. So even though they were deep into all this detailed textual study, they still saw it as having a purpose, a practical application. It wasn't just for the sake of knowledge itself.
Right. Qian Daxin, he was a big figure in the Caojing movement. He saw the five classics as having this practical value for ordering the world, the Jingxi, and extending utility, the Jiong. He believed Confucian learning was all about being practical, useful, not just talking about nature and heaven in the abstract.
So even the study of ancient texts, it was seen as contributing to good governance, to making society better. And Zhang Shucheng, who we mentioned earlier, he also grounded his ideas about historiography in this goal of ordering the world. He saw the classics as essentially guides for good governance. And historical learning, the Shikshu, it was directly linked to the Jingxi.
He believed that understanding history, it wasn't just an academic exercise, it was essential for being a good leader. So this urge to produce knowledge that was useful, knowledge that could improve the state and society, that was a driving force behind Qing scholarship.
It's like this practical, utilitarian impulse was baked into how they acted as philosophers. All right, so we've covered vitalism, historicism, and utilitarianism. Now for our final ideal type, intellectualism. What does this one tell us about how King scholars approached philosophical questions?
Intellectualism, in this context, it refers to a positive view of knowledge. It's about actively using your mind to pursue the Tao, the way, in the world around you. And it's a shift away from that focus on introspection, looking inward, that was so prominent in earlier periods. And part of this shift, it was a reaction to the problems in the late Ming Dynasty. The political turmoil, the social issues, the economic instability. They saw that the old ways weren't working.
So they were looking for solutions, and they thought that external knowledge, rigorous inquiry, that was the way to find them. They felt like the intense focus on internal enlightenment, it hadn't stopped the Ming from declining.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They looked to the classics, and they saw them as this authoritative source of knowledge. And they often looked back to antiquity, to this golden age of order and good governance. The source mentions Yi Yingxie, and he calls this outlook intellectualism, the Dao Wenshu, and he contrasts it with honoring one's heaven-endowed moral nature, the Zundexing. It's a move from looking inside yourself to looking outside, to texts, to the world you can observe.
So if Songming thought was all about this inner awakening, Qing intellectualism was about external objective knowledge. The classics, they became like the foundation for this rigorous inquiry. But our source says this wasn't a complete break from tradition. There were continuities, connections to Confucian thought.
Definitely, the emphasis on Wen, literature, textual learning, refinement, that's always been a big part of Confucianism. Qing intellectualism just gave it a new importance, a renewed emphasis. They saw it as a way to put knowledge into practice, to make it useful.
Okay. So the ultimate expression of this intellectualism, it seems like it's the Caojing movement, this super rigorous evidential research. Our source calls it an epical breakthrough because of how massive it was, how intense it was. It really opened up all these new questions about how to interpret the classics.
It did. By scrutinizing the text in such detail, they started to question if some were even authentic, to debate the interpretations, to put those ancient messages into historical context in a whole new way. It's fascinating how their attempt to purify tradition ended up transforming it.
And this intellectual energy, it wasn't just about the classics. It spilled over into history, geography, even the study of nature. It was a broader shift towards empirical inquiry.
A real spirit of investigation across different fields. Now, to understand this intellectualism, let's look at some key figures. Gu Yanwu, for instance, he thought that studying principle, Lixiu, it came down to studying the classics. Jingsu, he was all about textual analysis, even phonology, studying the sounds of words as tools for understanding.
He was trying to find the most accurate meaning of the text, to get back to the source. And he was critical of Chengdu's learning because he thought it ignored the classics. He really pushed for broad learning, for observing the world.
He was a big proponent of getting to know through extensive study and careful observation. He believed the classics were a record of the sages' experiences, their insights. And Huangzongxi, he followed the Luang school, but he reinterpreted Wang Yangming's concept of zhiliangzi, extending spontaneous moral knowing. But he saw extending not just as intuition, but as an active process of learning, examining, questioning, and carefully thinking things through.
So it wasn't just about having this innate moral sense. It was about using your intellect to learn and understand. And Wang Fuzi, he also played a big role here. He rejected these ideas of esoteric understanding, of sudden enlightenment. He believed true knowledge comes from learning, from actually studying and engaging with the world, the Qixing, and through careful observation, Gewu.
He believed in investigating things, the Giwu, using your mind and your senses. Knowledge came from interacting with the world, And by the 18th century, with the Qing movement in full swing, there was this shared belief that learning had to be concrete, based on evidence. The goal was to recover the original meaning of the sage's words through philological analysis. Qing, he talked about this a lot.
So there's this emphasis on accuracy, on a systematic, evidence-based approach to knowledge. Even Daizhen, who we've talked about before, he stressed the importance of study and inquiry, of really listening to the Tao. He saw that as essential for understanding principle, for understanding reality.
For Daizhen, intellectual inquiry, it wasn't just a step on the way to understanding, it was part and parcel of it. And even Zhang Zuoqing, he also redefined Wang Yangming's Zhiliangji. He emphasized the effort involved in seeking knowledge.
So it's not just passively soaking up information, it's an active, ongoing effort. So intellectualism in Qing philosophy wasn't just about facts. It was a shift in how knowledge was understood, how it was pursued. It prioritized external inquiry over internal contemplation. It put a premium on studying texts, on observing the world. These Qing scholars, they acted as philosophers by really diving into intellectual investigation.
Exactly. They shifted the focus from the individual mind to this more deliberate, more rigorous process of inquiry.
Okay, so that wraps up our deep dive. We've looked at how Qing scholars acted as philosophers through these four modes of thought. We talked about vitalism and the focus on key. We explored historicism and the importance of context and change. We delved into utilitarianism and the emphasis on practical application. And we examined intellectualism, this focus on external knowledge and inquiry.
And by looking at these different approaches, we get a much clearer picture of Qing dynasty thought. We see how these scholars wrestled with those big philosophical questions, how they came up with new and innovative ways of thinking shaped by their own unique historical context. They weren't just carrying on tradition, they were actively reshaping it.
And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listener. How do these different ideas, the focus on material reality, the importance of context, the emphasis on practical solutions, and the value of inquiry, how do they connect with how we think about the world today? What can we learn from these Qing Dynasty scholars, from how they acted as philosophers that can help us navigate our own complex world? Which of these ideal types do they resonate with you? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.